So let's take a look at the wall of the digestive tract, the GI tract layers. So obviously this is a hollow tube. We just talked about how it's a hollow tube, and there's going to typically be four concentric layers, and these are also called tunics. You might remember that word tunic from the blood vessel chapter. We talked about the three tunics of the different blood vessels. So we have tunics here in the layers of the GI tract as well. So the innermost is going to be the mucosa, and that is going to be the one that is going to actually be in contact with the nutrients, the food and the water and things like that we are actually taking in right in here. And then the next one is going to be that submucosa, and then the muscularis, and then the adventitia or serosa. So we'll go through and talk about how some of our organs don't have a serosa. Instead, they have something called an adventitia. Remember, the serosa is a serous membrane. And the serous membrane that's going to be found here in the GI tract is going to be the peritoneum. But remember, that's only in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we just introduced some organs that are not in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So those are going to be the ones that are surrounded by the adventitia. We'll get to that in a second. I'm jumping the gun there. So looking at first that mucosa, remember that is the inner lining of the mucous membrane. It is going to be the one that forms the lumen of the GI tract. It's going to consist, of course, of the epithelium. Most of the time, throughout most of the GI tract, it's going to be simple columnar epithelium. And the reason why, if you remember back to 2401, the main function of simple columnar epithelium is going to be secretion and absorption. So yes, that's going to be the main epithelium here. However, we do have portions that are going to be lined with stratified squamous epithelium, because remember, that was the tissue that was responsible for protection. So any structure that has to withstand any kind of abrasions, like your oral cavity, your pharynx, these are going to be lined with that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Right under that is going to, or beneath that, I guess I should say, is going to be the underlying lamina propria. This is going to have areolar connective tissue, and what we have in the areolar connective tissue is going to be blood vessels and nerves. And we'll talk about absorption and how nutrients are going to go through the epithelium. Because remember, simple columnar is responsible for secretion and absorption. So as soon as that nutrient goes into the simple columnar, it is going to move into the blood vessels here in the lamina propria of the mucosa. And then we also have a very small, thin, smooth muscle layer here in the mucosa called the muscularis mucosa, and that's where it gets its name. That's why it's called the muscularis mucosa, because it's found here in the mucosa. So don't get this one confused with the muscularis layer that we're going to talk about in a second. What this does is it is going to kind of contract a little bit to help get those secretions out of the different cell layers that are found along the epithelium. Or not cell layers, but the different cells, the different glands, or unicellular glands and things like that are going to be found there. But they're also going, whenever they contract, what they do is they're going to increase the contact of the materials in the lumen with the mucosa. So that means better absorption. So this is taking a look specifically at absorption. And remember how I talked about how simple columnar is going to absorb, because they are going to be the ones that is in contact with everything in the lumen here. So you have the little nutrients. So they're basically going to be molecules, small molecules like monosaccharides and things like that are going to go through, and they are going to be absorbed through that epithelial layer, the simple columnar epithelium. And then here's that lamina propria that is going to have the blood vessels. So certain ones are going to go into the bloodstream, but remember, we do have those fats, those lipids, those are going to go into the lymphatic capillaries. So that's what we have in there. So most things are going to go into the bloodstream. So this is why we have that lamina propria right underneath it that's rich in blood supply here and the lymphatic capillaries. So we can get the nutrients directly into the bloodstream or the lymphatic capillary so we can get it to where it needs to go. So let's take a look at the submucosa now. Again, we have more blood vessels here, more lymphatic vessels, and we have some nerves as well. So we have a little bit more. So it's going to kind of be a little bit larger than that lamina propria that we have. So the submucosa, specifically looking at the nerves, it is going to have something called the submucosal nerve plexus. And this is going to be nerves and ganglia that's going to innervate the smooth muscles and glands. We also have something called MALT. You guys remember MALT from your lymphatic chapter, that mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. I talked about how it's scattered throughout the abdominal pelvic cavity. And what these are going to be little patches, little nodules or clumps of lymphatic tissue. And specifically the ones that are found here in the gastrointestinal tract are called Peyer's patches. And what these are typically going to be found in the ileum, which is going to be the distal small intestine. And that is going to help with anything that we've ingested, any microbes that we've ingested that have kind of gone through, been able to survive the stomach contents. These Peyer's patches are going to make sure that those microbes don't cross the GI tract. And we eat a lot of microbes whenever any kind of food that we eat. So you really can't avoid eating microbes. It's just going to happen. All right, now here's that muscularis layer. So let me go back to that picture real quick. I should have put it on here, but I wanted to go back to that picture to kind of show you what the muscularis layer looks like, because this is a really good picture because of the fact that we have two different muscle layers here. So here is that muscularis layer. So we are going to have this inner one right here. This is the one that has all of the little nerves on it. This is the myenteric nerve plexus that we'll talk about. So this is going to be an inner circular layer. And the reason why it's called inner circular layer of muscles is because the bands of muscles are going to go around the circumference of the tube. And then we have an outer longitudinal layer right here. And as you can see, the muscle fibers are going to go the length of the GI tract. These are going to be super important in moving food down the digestive tract. We're going to talk about how the circular layer is going to kind of squeeze, and then the longitudinal is going to push it through and propel it that way. So we'll talk about mixing movements and moving food through the digestive system here in a second. We are going to get to the stomach, and we're going to take a look and see how the stomach actually has 3 layers of muscle tissue here in the muscularis layer. It actually has an oblique layer, and it allows the stomach to kind of churn and mix in ways that it needs to. So now let's take a look at the, we looked at that myenteric nerve plexus on the picture. So this is going to be the nerve plexus that is going to be responsible for controlling contractions, the contractions specific to the muscularis layer. So anytime that peristalsis, or that movement of food through the digestive tract that we'll take a look at, that signal is going to come from the myenteric nerve plexus. So I've talked about 2 nerve plexes. I think that's the plural for it. The 2 of them, the myenteric and the submucosal plexus. So one is going to be a sensory, and these are going to have sensory and motor neurons. This is actually going to compose something called the enteric nervous system. A lot of anatomists or a lot of scientists will actually put the myenteric nervous system as a completely separate nervous system and don't include it in the autonomic nervous system or anything like that. So again, what this does is it goes in, and we'll talk about, the different receptors that are going to be found throughout the digestive tract, but they detect the changes in the tract. They are also constantly checking the chemical content of the lumen, or the contents in the lumen, and things like that. Also, along the digestional tract, the digestional tract. I just put those two words together. The gastrointestinal tract, you're going to have portions of the muscularis layer that thickens. And what it does is it goes in and closes off the lumen. This is called a sphincter. So there's several different sphincters that are going to be found throughout the digestive tract. And mainly what they do is they are going to be gatekeepers. They are going to make sure that, if food's going down the esophagus, they're going to close it until, and it's going to make sure that the stomach is actually ready for food. And then you have one at the very end of the stomach, leading into the small intestine. And again, that one's going to be closed and contracted, and it's going to stay that way until the duodenum, that very first part of the small intestine, is ready for food. So these are really important in controlling the way that the food moves, or not really moves, but the way that the food enters into the next section of the gastrointestinal tract. So I mentioned this word peristalsis a couple of times already. So now let's talk about the definition and the different types of movements we have here in the digestive tract. So peristalsis is going to be one movement that we have in the digestive tract. What this is, it's a rhythmic pattern, a rhythmic alternating contraction that's going to happen between the inner circular layer that's going to happen. So it's basically going in, whenever you're out of toothpaste and you're trying to squeeze that toothpaste to the end of your tube, that's kind of what's happening with peristalsis. So you going in and pinching your finger is going to be kind of like that inner circular layer going in and squeezing right behind it. And then the longitudinal muscles are actually going to shorten, so it can move it to the next area and propel it through the digestive tract there. So that's kind of like when you pinch it, they're circular, and then whenever you move the toothpaste down to the tube, that's kind of like your outer longitudinal layers contracting and pushing it down that way. So this is rhythmic. It is going to start in the esophagus, and it's going to go all the way down the digestive tract until we have propelled everything through the tract. So it is going to go all the way through the very end of course, the large intestine, because that's going to be basically the end right there at the rectum and the anus. You have another type of movement called a mixing movement, and this is going to be completely different than peristalsis. So peristalsis is going to propel food down a digestive tract. Mixing is not about moving food down somewhere. Mixing is going to be this back and forth kind of motion that is going to, what it's doing is it's going in and breaking the food contents apart. And it's going to go in and kind of blend it and mix it with the ingested materials and the secretions in that specific organ. So we'll talk about mixing movements of the stomach and how they are going to be responsible for breaking up this bolus of food, but then mixing it with all of that gastric juice. So mixing is not rhythmic at all. It is just going to go in there, specifically if you look at the small intestine. And we have a specific word for what's happening in the small intestine called segmentation. So what segmentation is, and you can remember segmentation happens in the small intestine because they both start with an S. So segmentation happens in the small intestine, and that's going to be where you have this long tube and it just goes in and breaks it apart like this, and keeps on breaking it apart. And creating this larger surface area of the food so we can go in and digest and absorb as much food as possible, nutrients as possible. So this is taking a look at it here. So here is the peristalsis. Again, I showed you there's that circular, those circular muscles, like I said with the toothpaste, and then the longitudinal ones are going to contract and shorten so it can move that food down. We'll talk about what a bolus of food is later on. And then here's that mixing movement, that what's happening. It's going to go in and break down. As you can see, you start with this big bolus of food, but you break it down into smaller little pieces of food for that kind of mixing motion. All right, and last but not least, on the very outside, this is the outermost tunic here, is going to be either the adventitia or the serosa. So the adventitia is going to be composed of an areolar connective tissue, and that is it. It is found outside of the peritoneal cavity. So this is going to be found on like the pharynx, and specifically the esophagus is going to be found on The serosa is going to be the serous membrane that is going to be found in the peritoneal cavity, in that abdominal pelvic cavity. It covers so what it is, it's going to be the visceral peritoneum there.